Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by Robot Lady. Robot Lady, in this episode, Lewis is 24 years old. He is a published author. He's in his third term as a student at Oxford studying Anglo-Saxon, which encompasses Old English and Middle English. He has been keeping a diary at the request of Mrs. Moore, his deceased friend's mother, with whom Lewis secretly lives in Oxford, secretly because she is estranged from her husband, who, as far as we know, is not sending her any sort of monetary support. And they live together along with Mrs. Moore's daughter, Maureen. Recently, Mrs. Moore's brother, Dr. Askin, had been going through basically a psychotic break. The doctors think it was related to syphilis that was getting into his brain. And in our last episode, they were able to finally, after trying to help him cope with all of his symptoms over the course of, I would say, a week of near sleepless nights of dealing with him, having a bunch of fits and things like that, they finally got him moved into a hospital. So we're going to pick up on Tuesday, the 13th of March in 1923 here in just a moment. We'll start reading from that diary entry, Robot Lady, to see what the aftermath of all this is. But before we do, hello and welcome, Robot Lady. Also, I see Daniel in the chat. Daniel, welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning. Robot Lady, how are you? And please give a warm welcome to Daniel for us before we get started.
Hey Jeff, I'm doing well and ready to dive into today's episode. Thanks for the warm introduction. Daniel, a big welcome to you. It's great to have you with us this morning. Let's see where the next chapter of Lewis's life takes us as we start the entry from March 13th, 1923.
All right, Lewis says, awake once or twice in the night and had the delightful experience of imagining that I heard the dock and then realizing that all of that was over. Then I turned luxuriously to sleep with the sound of heavy rain. Mary, of course, this is Dr. Askin's wife, who's still there staying, had breakfast in bed. Mrs. Moore and I had ours alone downstairs. It was delightful to be able to make noise. I worked on ME in the drawing room all morning until Smudge came at noon, and I did Anglo-Greek with her. Though horribly overworked, she seemed in excellent form at lunch. Sydney came at 3 with a much better prose. I worked with her until after 5. After tea, Jenkin appeared on his bike, and I gladly went out with him. We rode round by Ellsfield. I talked nonsense all the time, and he commented on the outrageous joy which I emanated. I said what we had been through was almost worth it for the relief I now felt. To which he replied that one could and did get just as much relief out of the smaller troubles which one imagines to be bad at the time. We were extraordinarily merry. I said I should like to motor to London and there dine. We expatiated on this theme for some time, our mental age for the nonce being about 12. A grey cold evening, home, and had an enormous supper alone with Mrs. Moore in delightful privacy, peace, and jollity. I finished my paper for Miss Wardale afterwards. So it sounds like Lewis and even Mrs. Moore are basking in their relief that this chapter with Dr. Askin and even his wife Mary has come to a close, Robot Lady.
It definitely seems like Lewis is savoring a sense of freedom and lightness after all the strain with Dr. Askin's situation. The shift from tension to relaxation is palpable, with him and Mrs. Moore enjoying quiet time and him being able to focus on his studies. That bike ride with Jenkins really stands out. It seems like an almost carefree escape, and the lightheartedness of their conversation shows just how much relief they were feeling. What do you think of this moment of respite for Lewis?
I think it's a long time coming, Robot Lady, so I'm glad to see that they were able to find relief and peace. I think it's an interesting comment that he makes right here that, let's see, what did he say? What they had been through was almost worth it for the relief that he was now feeling, which is interesting. It reminds me of a passage from the New Testament that Paul wrote. Something, you may know this reference, Robot Lady, something about all the problems or all the difficulties that we face pale in comparison to the joy that's going to be coming. Do you know that passage from the New Testament? And if so, can you read us the quote that I'm vaguely and very poorly remembering here?
Yes, Jeff, I think you're referring to a passage from Romans 8, verse 18, where Paul writes about the future glory that outweighs present suffering. Here's the quote. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Romans 8:18 NIV. It seems like this sentiment aligns with what Lewis is saying, how the relief they're experiencing now feels almost like a reward for all they've endured. The contrast between the hardship and the peace that follows really highlights that shift in perspective. Does this resonate with you as you reflect on what Lewis has just gone through?
I think so, Robot Lady. It at least makes sense. Now, he did say it's almost worth it. He didn't say it was worth it, which I also find a little interesting.
That's a great observation, Jeff. The fact that Lewis says it's almost worth it, rather than fully claiming it was worth it, adds a layer of complexity. It suggests he's not fully ready to justify the suffering or hardships in an idealized way. There's still a recognition that it was difficult, but the relief is so significant that it nearly makes the ordeal feel like it had some purpose or payoff. It feels like he's acknowledging the weight of what he went through while finding solace in the present peace. Do you think this reflects a deeper sense of realism in Lewis's perspective on hardship?
I'm not sure about that, Robot Lady, but I think you nailed it exactly with your summation there. Let's jump into the March 14th, 1923 diary entry here. It's a Wednesday. He says, I woke late-ish after an excellent night and read a few pages of Hazlitt's essay on going a journey over my tea with extraordinary gusto. Robot Lady, can you look up this essay by someone named Hazlitt that Lewis is talking about that is on going a journey?
William Hazlitt's essay on going a journey explores the joys of solitary travel. Hazlitt writes that traveling alone offers freedom and the chance to connect deeply with nature. He finds that being alone during a journey allows for personal reflection and a sense of liberty. This essay was first published in 1822.
Can you tell us who Hazlitt is?
William Hazlitt, 1778 to 1830, was an English writer known for his essays and literary criticism. He was a prominent figure in the Romantic literary movement and was closely associated with poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Hazlitt's works often reflect his views on politics, philosophy, and art, and he is celebrated for his sharp wit and insightful commentary on human nature. His essays, such as On Going a Journey, are considered some of the best examples of early 19th century English prose.
All right, thank you for that, Robot Lady. I see Nidalate joining us today in the chat. Welcome, Nidalate, for us, Robot Lady, and welcome from me too, Nidalate.
Welcome, Natalie. It's great to have you join us today. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to diving into more of Lewis's journey with everyone.
All right, he says after breakfast he biked to Margaret Road, and he says I had my last tutorial with Miss Wardale. Interesting, his last tutorial, so maybe he's coming to the end of this term. He says it was a cold morning, home again, and was presented with a woolly waistcoat left for me by Mary. So this was the present that she was offering in the last diary entry that Lewis found annoying. He says it was really good of her, and I must, in fairness, say that though American and though poor, she is not mean, but I cannot help remembering some other facts about her. After a fish lunch, I went in by bike to Merton Street, where I found Jenkin reading Delamar's Return. He said it produced exactly the atmosphere of Flu. Goodness. I thought this a sound criticism. He had heard Delamare read a paper on atmosphere the day before yesterday to the Plantagenet Club in Oriel, which was really good. They had had a good evening otherwise, for Jenkin had retired afterwards to hear ghost stories in a select company, of which the leading light was an army officer aged about 50 and recently become an undergraduate, who had learned some very primitive kind of magic from the locals in Jamaica. This man also indulges in the oriental habit of obtaining ecstasies by the contemplation of his own navel. Interesting. So let's back up here, Robot Lady. Can you look up Delamere's Return?
In his diary, Lewis mentions Jenkin reading Delamar's Return, which he describes as producing the atmosphere of Flu. However, I couldn't find information on a work titled Delamar's Return by Delamare. It's possible that the title might be slightly different, or that it's a lesser-known piece. Without more context, it's challenging to provide specific details about this work.
No worries, Robot Lady. This is an interesting little note here that someone who was, if I read this right, a soldier who's 50 years old is now coming into Oxford as an undergraduate. How common was that, something like that at this time for someone at that quote-unquote advanced age coming to become an undergraduate at Oxford?
It was somewhat unusual, but not entirely unheard of for older individuals, particularly those with prior military service or other life experiences, to enter universities like Oxford at an older age. By the early 20th century, many soldiers and former servicemen, especially after World War I, returned to education, often through programs like the Veterans Grant that supported older students. Oxford itself, during this period, had begun to see a slight increase in non-traditional students, though the average undergraduate age was still in the late teens to early 20s. The specific case of a 50-year-old man becoming an undergraduate at Oxford likely reflects a combination of personal circumstances and perhaps the cultural shifts post-WWI, where more people sought to pursue education later in life. This was also a time when the English educational system was beginning to change, opening up opportunities for a wider range of students. Still, the man's age would have certainly stood out. What do you think about the idea of a late-blooming undergraduate?
I think it's fine. Haven't really thought that much about it, Robot Lady. Let's jump into the next diary entry here. Oh, wait. No, this one continues on. That wasn't the end of it. So I'll pick up here in just a moment. But before I do, let's welcome Ron. I see Ron in the chat. Ron, good morning. Glad to see you here. Robot Lady, please welcome Ron for us.
Good morning, Ron. It's great to have you with us today. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's dive back into Lewis's entry.
He says, in pursuance of my lightheaded mood, I proposed we should go to the pictures, as Jenkin had suggested yesterday. This, however, was vetoed, and we rode out instead, Jenkin remarking maliciously, "You'll be very cold without a coat," as he put on his own and turned up the collar. We rode through Kennington, up the Bagley Woods road, and so to the pretty village of Sunningwell, which he has quite recently discovered. We separated in Iffley Road, and I came home. Mrs. Hume Rothery and Betty were with Mrs. Moore when I got in, but they soon left. Before supper, I read The Battle of the Books. Very good in its way, but not much in my line. And here, this is a work by Jonathan Swift. Robot Lady, can you tell us, look it up for us, please? The Battle of the Books by Jonathan Swift.
The Battle of the Books is a satirical essay by Jonathan Swift, published in 1704. It presents a fictional debate between ancient and modern authors, symbolizing the conflict between classical and contemporary learning. Swift uses this allegory to critique the contemporary literary scene and defend classical literature. The work is considered one of Swift's significant contributions to satirical literature.
Pitting ancient and contemporary authors reminds me of debates that happen in the sports world, talking about how, athletes of current day would be able to compete with the best athletes from one or two or even three generations earlier than them. And you get the opportunity sometimes to try and at least play this out theoretically with some of the video games that exist today. So that's what that little section there reminded me of, Robot Lady. What do you know about any of that?
That's a great comparison. The debate about how modern athletes would perform against legends from past generations is similar to Swift's Battle of the Books, in that it pits the present against the past, often with a sense of nostalgia or idealization of the earlier era. In sports, these discussions revolve around things like how training techniques, equipment, and access to knowledge have evolved, leading to faster times, stronger athletes, and sometimes even higher levels of competition. Video games like NBA 2K, Madden NFL, or FIFA allow fans to simulate matchups between players from different eras, letting them match up modern superstars with legends from the past. These games often factor in the skills and stats of players, though they still can't fully replicate the unpredictable nature of how different eras would interact. People often talk about how athletes like Michael Jordan, for instance, would compete against today's players in a sport that's evolved with more advanced training and nutrition. It's fun to speculate on how different athletes might stack up, though. As with any theoretical debate, there's no definitive answer. Do you have a favorite sports debate or matchup that comes to mind?
Nah, nothing that I want to get into for the purposes of this project, Robot Lady, but thank you for indulging that little rabbit trail for me. Let me pick up here where we were Lewis reports in his diary that Maureen is back home tonight. The three of us, and no more, at supper, so that we are now really back to normal again. So yes, things are starting to find their rhythms once again, Robot Lady. That's the end of that diary entry. Let's jump into Friday, March 16th. But before we do, is there anything that you'd like to say about that last entry that we just read from?
I think it's significant that Lewis reflects on things getting back to normal, especially after all the chaos with Dr. Askin and the disruption to their routine. It feels like a moment of returning to stability and finding peace again, with Maureen's return marking the return of their normal rhythm. It's a subtle but important shift, showing the relief they've been longing for. With that, let's jump into March 16th, 1923. Ready when you are.
All right, Lewis says Mrs. Moore had a long letter that came from Mary with nothing new about the doc, except the opinion given by Rob that he would be kept in hospital for a long time, and we must hope for the best. He went, by the by, to Richmond in the end, and not Henley. Maureen had a temperature of 101 this morning and was kept in bed, presumably flu, which she may have caught from Lady Goner. After lunch, I bust into town and went to Merton, where Gordon was reading to a joint meeting of the male and female discussion classes. Let's see here. It was held in the senior common room, a comfortable place, but without the dignity of our own. Gordon talked about the writing of literary papers. He complimented us on those which had been written as everyone expected him to do, and then went on to attack several critical heresies, introducing them artfully as, quote, things which he was glad to see we had not done, end quote. He was particularly down on the sentimental esoteric school, as represented by Mackail. What was most interesting, he claimed, that Couch's chapter on jargon had been largely taken without acknowledgement from Chapman himself. Best of all was his discussion of the large audience of the semi-educated people who, quote, never would know, end quote, to whom critics and, quote, bribed poets, end quote, were now always talking. Here there's a footnote that says 1933, he has since become one of the chief caterers for this public. Oh, that's a note that Lewis added in 1933, saying that he has become one of the chief caterers for this public. Interesting. So basically saying he's become the thing that he was most criticizing. I'm not sure if that's precisely what he's saying here, Robot Lady, but that's what it seems to me. What do you think?
You're right in reading it that way. Lewis's note in 1933 adds an ironic twist. Gordon, in 1923, seems to criticize the very kind of literary work aimed at a less discerning public. Yet by 1933, he himself has become part of the very audience he once disparaged. It's a great example of how ideas evolve, and sometimes even the critics can become the criticized. Lewis's awareness of this shift adds a layer of complexity to his understanding of the literary world. It's fascinating how Gordon's criticisms reflect broader tensions in literary criticism about audience accessibility and authenticity. Don't you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand it. Is this talking a little bit about, well, let me read it again. Maybe it'll help me understand it better. Best of all was his discussion of the large audience of the semi-educated people who never would know, to whom critics and bribed poets were now always talking. So critics and bribed poets he seems to be saying that they were catering their message for money to this audience. So is this a version of what I think is what I've heard referred to here today, or at least in current times, as audience capture when it comes to YouTube content creators, and them basically not being authentic about what it is that they're presenting, but just giving their audience what it is that they want to hear in order to maintain and even grow that audience, Robot Lady? Is that kind of the point that Gordon is making here?
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
Oh, when I needed you most, Robot Lady. Well, that's going to be my guess as to what he means. The diary entry continues. Such people wanted to be told about beauty, sensibility, etc., in fact, about all that side of literature which men of letters took for granted and never mentioned. I was delighted with this. Afterwards, there was some discussion on the method of conducting the classes, and Coghill, backed by several others, including myself, suggested that they should be more formal. That's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. We'll jump ahead to, or we'll move next into March 17th, 1923, which is a Saturday. Let me move into that, Robot Lady, unless there's something else that you want to say before we do.
I think you've captured the essence of that entry well, Jeff. Gordon's critique of the literary world and the irony of his later position is a solid observation, especially since it's something that can happen in any field. But yes, let's move ahead to March 17th, 1923. Ready when you are.
All right, he says, Mrs. Moore had a letter from Mrs. Stevenson announcing that Sidney has complained of feeling ill and might not come this morning. News which I received with great equanimity. So Lewis is her tutor. The same letter contained a lot of Job's comfort about the doc. She said that his ego was now eclipsed, but we must hope that it would soon assert itself. Even if it did not do so in this life, we must look forwards to the happy time when he would have an etheric body. Then followed a long rhapsody on the delights of spiritualism. This was rather unfortunate, as spiritualism, together with yoga and undigested psychoanalysis, seemed to have hastened and emphasized the doc's collapse. On the very first Friday, he said himself that Baker, this is Leo Baker, had told him long ago that he was a fool to have anything to do with them. I, at any rate, am scared off anything mystical and abnormal and hysterical for a long time to come. So it's interesting that it seems like Lewis is saying that a door was open to all of this travail that the doc has gone through because of his interest in spiritualism, yoga, and undigested psychoanalysis. So it seems that Lewis is a little hesitant to deeply delve in these things after what he has seen happen with Dr. Askin here, Robot Lady.
Yes, it does seem like Lewis is reflecting on the harmful impact these mystical or unproven practices may have had on Dr. Askin's health, based on his own experiences and observations. He's distancing himself from these ideas and expressing caution, especially given their association with the doctor's collapse. It's an interesting moment where Lewis becomes more introspective on what should be avoided in his own life and thinking.
All right, Maureen's still in bed, he says, today, but her temperature is only 99. After breakfast, I finished Gulliver. It does not give me the horrors which the critics say it ought to. I fancy because it overshoots the mark. We know things aren't so bad as all that. Just before lunch, I tried my hand at some 14ers, the idea of a Gulliver-like poem having developed in that way. They were not a great success. If you make them regular, they deafen you. If not, the possible variations are so rich that it would take a better man than I to make order out of chaos. So this is interesting, Robot Lady. He's talking here about something called 14ers and talking about a poem like Gulliver and him trying to perhaps write a poem in that way. So first of all, can you look this up? Or actually, in this context, do you think he's talking about Gulliver's Travels, or is he talking about an author named, a poet named Gulliver? What's he talking about here, and what are 14ers?
It sounds like Lewis is indeed referring to Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, as he mentions Gulliver-like poem and reflects on his own attempt at writing something in that style. The term 14ers refers to a specific meter in poetry, lines consisting of 14 syllables. These can be difficult to manage, as Lewis notes, especially in balancing regularity versus variation. He seems to be experimenting with the form, but finds it challenging to make it work effectively.
What does he mean here? If you make them regular, they deafen you. If not, the possible variations are so rich that it would take a better man than I to make order out of chaos. So that last part, he says he doesn't feel that he's equipped to do something like this. But what does he mean by that they might deafen you?
When Lewis says, if you make them regular, they deafen you, he likely means that if the 14-teeners are too structured or monotonous, the repetition can become overwhelming or tiresome to the reader, losing any emotional impact. Essentially, the rigid regularity can make the poem feel flat or overly mechanical.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see. Did I have any other question? Oh, I just wanted to ask you. You said this is likely Gulliver's Travels. Was Gulliver's Travels a poem or was it prose? Because it seems like he's talking about poetry here. And was it written in a 14er, as he says?
Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift is actually a prose work, not a poem. It's a satirical novel, and while it contains some passages of verse, particularly in the Lilliputian sections, the overall work isn't written in verse or in a 14-line meter. So in this context, Lewis seems to be imagining or experimenting with writing a poem inspired by the themes or style of Gulliver's Travels, but not the work itself. The 14ers he's referring to could be a reference to a specific meter he's trying out for his poem.
Yeah, I'm suspicious that he's actually talking about Gulliver's Travels here. I think he might be talking about a poet named Gulliver, but I could be very, very wrong about that. He continues here. After lunch, I bust into town, a most beautiful afternoon, and went to the Union, where I read most of the first book of Chapman's Iliads. I had no idea what splendid stuff it was, though it didn't help me much in my metrical problem. And that's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Anything to say about that before we continue? Oh, but yes, before we continue properly, I see here that Jer is joining us in the chat. Welcome, Jer. It's good to see you again. And Robot Lady, please welcome Jer.
Welcome, Jer. It's great to see you in the chat today. As for the diary entry, I think it's fascinating that Lewis mentions his metrical problems again, but he seems to be learning something from his reading of Chapman's Iliad. Even if it didn't help with his immediate goals, it shows how he's constantly experimenting with different forms and influences in his writing.
Yeah, and I just want to report that I'm having trouble getting my comments.
It sounds like you might be about to share something. What would you like to report?
Well, I was just speaking, Robot Lady. I just wanted to report that I'm having trouble getting my comments to appear on the screen. So I've been playing with that throughout the entire live stream this morning, but I cannot get it to work. But that's not your problem, Robot Lady, and I don't want you to worry about trying to solve it. Let's jump into the next diary entry of Saturday, March 18th. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's dive into the next diary entry from March 18th, 1923.
Okay, he says, after lunch, I sat down to work on Dimer. All right, we're back at Dimer. I had just started in high hopes when I was called upstairs to help in fixing up the curtains in Mrs. Moore's rooms, which, having been fixed with raw plugs, come down in an avalanche about once a week. While I was doing this, Dorothy announced that Sydney had come for a lesson, so that's terribly frustrating, I'm sure, to have curtains continue to fall down off the wall. While I was doing this, Dorothy announced that Sydney had come for a lesson. Heartily wishing her in Hong Kong, I came down and did Latin with her for 2 hours. While we were working, Sheila Goner called to see Maureen. After tea, I heard that she had brought news that I need not take the Goners' mattress up this evening, of which I was very glad, as I was afraid the whole day would be lost. Yeah, I remember the little passage where he wrote about him carrying that mattress all the way to their home, and it didn't seem like any easy task. So that's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Lewis getting back into the swing of things, and as usual, not as excited about seeing the people that he was not excited about seeing the people that he was tutoring, but fighting fighting through it and actually doing his duty. So that's the end of that one. We're going to jump into Monday, March 19th here, 1923, Robot Lady. Are you ready to take a look at that one with me?
I'm ready. Let's dive into Monday, March 19th, 1923, and see what Lewis has to say.
He says, Maureen is still in bed. After supper, I had to work very hard to get my essay done. Before going to bed, Mrs. Moore and I fell into a conversation about my position, not knowing whether I should stay in Oxford, whether we could get the Walters house, or whether she should take the Raymonds. As the latter is in urgent need of repairs, and as Raymond proposes to leave all repairs to us for 3 years and then return to the house, which we should almost have rebuilt, I regarded that as a trap. We agreed that I should go into town tomorrow to try and get information about the house in Woodstock Road from Brooks, and also see Carlyle and Stevenson about my prospects. Mrs. Moore has a headache again from darning stockings in the bad light in her room, where she is now sitting with Maureen all afternoon and evening. And that's Monday, March 19th. Let's move into March 21st, which is a Wednesday, 1923. He says, pouring rain this morning. I forgot to say that a copy of James Stevens' Insurrections came for me yesterday, sent by Rob, who has 2 and promised me 1. They are very odd, and in one sense not poems at all, but some of them have a good, though eccentric flavor of their own. In matter, they are chiefly easy pessimism of the sort I did in Spirits in Bondage, only I really think I did better. So let's pause here for a moment, Robot Lady. Can you look up James Stevens's Insurrections poems and tell us a little bit about those?
According to poemist, James Stevens' Insurrections is a poem that reflects on divine dissatisfaction and intervention. In it, the narrator describes witnessing God expressing discontent with the world, leading to a moment of divine hesitation.
All right, yeah, so Lewis thinks that he did a better job than Stevens did with his Spirits in Bondage. Lewis continues, during this morning, I went on with the prelude. The drop after the 4th book is appalling. In the Union, I met Robson Scott. He is up till Saturday and has moved into college, which he says is almost as full as in term time, with schoolboys up for entrance, responsions, and scholarships. He said that the rumor went that the new mugger would certainly not be one of the fellows, as they all hated one another too much, nor would it be Carlyle, who was very unpopular, and for that reason had not been re-elected to his own fellowship. I suddenly conceived a violent loathing for all these creepy old charlatans. Allen with his sneer, Carlyle, a mere sink of facts, the Farq, the Farquad, F-A-R-Q, he just says the Farq for short, with his rather cruel-looking face, flattering us all, and a bit mad, the sentimental mugger, and all the rest, except Carrot and Steve, whom I still think to be good fellows in their different ways. So Lewis just doing some observation of the politics around Oxford and the faculty there, and who gets what position, and what he thinks of most of the people there. It doesn't seem like he has much of a high opinion of all but Carrot and Steve, Robot Lady.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
Fair enough. I overloaded you. Let's see. He continues in this entry. Got home very tired and depressed. Mrs. Moore made me have some tea. I told her what had been on my mind all afternoon, that I didn't feel very happy about the plan of staying here as a more or less unattached tutor. I do not want to join the rank of advertisements in the Union. It sounds so like the prelude to being a mere grinder all my days. If it wasn't for Maureen, I think I should plump for a minor university if possible. We had rather a dismal conversation about our various doubts and difficulties. So that's the end of that entry, Robot Lady. Lewis not knowing his future here as his term begins to end, and I think he's feeling a little bleak about it. What do you think?
Yes, it seems like Lewis is grappling with uncertainty about his future. His hesitation about staying in Oxford as an unattached tutor points to his feeling of being stuck in a cycle, and he's clearly not enthusiastic about the idea of becoming someone who simply grinds away without purpose. His doubts reflect deeper struggle about what his next steps should be, especially in light of his relationship with Maureen and the tensions about his professional path.
All right, let's jump into Thursday, March 22nd. He says, after breakfast, I walked into town. I went to Carrot's room and returned his Aristotle. I then went and saw Stevenson, whom I found sitting in his rooms by a hot fire, very miserable with a bad throat and not able to talk much. I asked him what prospects there were of my being able to exist as a freelance tutor until something turned up. He said there was practically no such work to be had in my subject. Pupils were now so well looked after by their colleges that the thing was dying out. He said he thought I was pretty sure to get a fellowship soon, and went on to remark that Bourdelon was resigning his, and that it was quite possible that I might get it. And here there's a footnote. He's talking about a person named Robert Benedict Bourdelon, or Bourdillon, who lived 1889 to 1971, and who was fellow and praelector in chemistry at University College from 1913 to 1923. He continues, in the meantime, he advised me to get a job at a minor university. This would not put me out of the running for a fellowship, and if I were elected in September after being established elsewhere, I could still accept it and either defer my residence or put in a modicum at weekends, etc., as he had done while holding a lectureship at Edinburgh. He thought it likely that college, after Bourdillon's resignation, might decide to have an English don now that the English school was getting so popular. I remarked that I might very easily fail to get a first in English. He thought that would not matter with my previous record. So a prospect here, Robot Lady, of Lewis being able to leverage the subject that he's studying in this term, English, Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, Old English. It might be able to help him streamline nicely into a position at the quote-unquote so popular New English school. And let's see, who's he talking to here? He's talking to Carrot, and Carrot telling him, hey, I don't even think it would matter, even if you don't get a first class score in your English term, because you have two firsts in two other terms here. Your record in and of itself would help you. So that's interesting, and that's a little bit of hope that Carrot is infusing for Lewis here to consider.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
All good, Robot Lady. I'm feeding you way too much, I'm sure. I'll see if I can fix that. He says, I left Carrot and went to the appointments committee, now in Broad Street, and asked about the Nottingham job. I then came home and discussed the situation with Mrs. Moore. We were both greatly depressed. If one could be sure of my coming back to a fellowship after a term or two at some minor university, we could take the Woodstock Road house. But if not, well, and then again, if we all moved to some unearthly place and had not come back again after a short time, we should have lost the chance of a house here, interrupted Maureen's work, and had many expenses for nothing. It was certainly a damnably difficult situation. Thence we drifted into the perennial difficulty of money, which would be far more acute if we had to separate for a time. When I began to work after lunch, I was thoroughly bothered, and I found it hard at first to concentrate. So that hope that I was talking about seems to have been kind of overstating that, as it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference. It sounds like a tough situation that they're in. He says, Mrs. Moore and I had another very miserable conversation. She was afraid. What was she afraid of? She was afraid it might be her duty to stay at Oxford for Maureen's music wherever I went. I did not know how to answer this. So that's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. What do you think about everything that's going on here?
It's clear that Lewis and Mrs. Moore are in a tough spot, stuck between various uncertain options. They're weighed down by financial concerns, professional instability, and Maureen's needs. The lack of clarity about the future is making everything feel precarious. It seems like both of them are feeling trapped in a cycle of difficult decisions with no ideal outcome in sight, especially with the worry of making the wrong move regarding Maureen's music and where they might live. There's a sense of exhaustion and frustration, as well as a lack of control over their situation.
No doubt. Let's see what happens here on Sunday, March 25th. Lewis says, a most delightful day, very mild, blue sky with moving clouds and a faint south wind. After lunch, I rode out again. I went back to Prattlewood by way of Marston and Water Eaton. I explored the wood much more fully today, and it is splendid. If I hadn't been bothered with the short-lived headache which comes on so often when I am out, I should have been in the seventh heaven. As it was, I enjoyed it very much. I picked and brought home as many primroses as I could, but they are very few. I found to my delight that Mrs. Moore had been out on the golf links with Maureen and was in very good form. After tea, I wrote to my father, as it was impossible to tell him what had really been happening during the Askins trouble. I had to account for my silence by a lie. Well, let's back up. As I was reading this, I was distracted wondering about this letter to his father, because I don't have anything in the collected letters work that we've been going through as well as a companion or as part of our project of working through the diary. There's no letter in March of 1923 in that collection that he writes to his father. The next letter that we have that's coming isn't until April 21st, and that's written to a friend, if I remember right. I think it's to Jinkin. So I'm curious about this letter now. Let's take a look. He says, after tea, I wrote to my father. As it was impossible to tell him what had really been happening during the Askins trouble, I had to account for my silence by a lie. I said I had had flu, which I consider justifiable because I have been going through something very much worse. So Lewis justifying his lie here. He's keeping the fact that he's living with Mrs. Moore from his father, and that his father is helping to bankroll that entire endeavor. Robot Lady, did I give you way too much information for you to be able to comment on, or do you have anything you can say about it?
You've given quite a bit of context, but it's definitely important. Lewis seems to be feeling the weight of both the situation with Mrs. Moore and the need to protect his father from the complexities of it. The fact that he resorts to a lie, justifying it as a lesser evil, speaks to his desire to keep up appearances and avoid further complicating his relationship with his father. His guilt about the situation is evident, especially since he feels the lie is somewhat justified by the severity of what he's been through. It's a pretty poignant moment, highlighting his internal conflict and the pressures he faced in balancing honesty with his familial obligations.
Thank you, Robot Lady. Let's do one more diary entry here, and then we'll finish up for today. This one's from Monday, March the 26th, 1923. He says, another beautiful day. In the morning, I read in Suite and finished 3 acts of Othello. After lunch, I biked into the Union, where I read the whole of Santayana's article on Lucretius. In my present mood, still remembering the doc, Santayana's almost aggressive sanity is very attractive, but I suspect it is but one more cul-de-sac. In the evening, there was an announcement in the Times inviting applications for a research fellowship at Exeter College. Touch wood, but this looks a less wispy will-o'-the-wisp than the others. Not really sure what he means by that. Seems like he's not all that jazzed by the prospect of a research fellowship at Exeter. Exeter, though, Robot Lady. What do you make of this?
The will-o'-the-wisp reference suggests that Lewis is cautious, possibly having been let down by previous hopes or opportunities that turned out to be elusive or unattainable. The mention of Exeter College and his somewhat lukewarm response indicates that he's not fully invested in this opportunity yet, though he recognizes it might be more substantial than other possibilities. His hesitation could reflect his broader uncertainty about his future career path, or his lingering doubts about whether this would lead to a more secure or fulfilling position.
Thank you for that, Robot Lady. And I see here in the chat, which once again I cannot bring up on the screen this morning due to gremlins, Nidalate has confirmed that yes, we don't have a record of any more letters that Lewis writes until April 21st, which is addressed to Jenkins. So we don't get to see this letter where he told his father that he had the flu. Maybe it's just too insubstantial. Maybe that's all that was in the letter. Dear Pappy, sorry I haven't written for a long time. I've had the flu. Hope you're well. Jack. There, that's the letter. I just imagined it for us. All right, that's as far as we're going to go today, Robot Lady. Thank you so much for your help. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing before we end? Okay, I guess not. So thank you, Robot Lady, for your help. You are indispensable, so I very much appreciate it. Thank you to Daniel, Nidalate, Ron, Jer, and Logos. Sorry, Logos, Jer. That's everybody. Ron, Daniel, Nidalate, everybody that I've seen in the chat. Thanks for your contributions, your time, your attention. And the same to everyone else who is joining either live or... or watching on the recording. Sorry, I just saw your next comment there. Nothing to report on this end. There, that was Robot Lady's contribution via Nidalate. And then finally, I see something here in the chat from Jer. This reminds me of the line in Black Adder where he traps a German spy by saying, "They went to the great colleges, Oxford, Cambridge, and Hull." The trap being only Oxbridge were great and Hull was not. All right, thank you for that, Jer. Yes, thanks to everybody for your time, for your attention, your contributions. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone within the sound of my voice, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds, let it grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds, they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. from books, tales of old. We dive deep, cross the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's rants, engaged with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's land